think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello to everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual symposium, Masking Religious Freedom Violations, a collaboration between Canopy Forum and the International Institute of Religious Freedom. My name is Ariel Lieberman. I'm the managing editor of Canopy Forum and the Paul and Marian Kuntz Scholar in Law and Religion here at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion based at Emory University. We are so excited to have such a distinguished group of scholars presenting here today. I wanted to start with a few words of introduction on the part of Canopy Forum and the Center for the Study of Law and Religion before I turn it over to our conference organizer, Dr. Dennis Petrie. The Center for the Study of Law and Religion is a nonpartisan and interdisciplinary research center founded in 1982 here at Emory University. We publish the leading journal of law and religion in partnership with Cambridge University Press. We have multiple book series published with presses as notable as Routledge, Brill, and Cambridge. We have a network of over 100 affiliated faculty, and we have organized dozens of interdisciplinary conferences. In 2019, we started Canopy Forum, a digital publication that attempts to bring some of our scholarship and scholarship from the wider field of law and religion to a wider audience. To truly act as a forum, it's important to bring together academics, practitioners, community members, and interested writers from all over the world. We at Canopy Forum are proud to say that we have published over 500 articles, a fair few on the broader subject of religious freedom, and have readers in every country in the world. This virtual conference is a great opportunity to continue our mission, gathering together and hearing from our distinguished group of panelists who, together, cover a wide range of expertise and experience. This will likely be different from most academic conferences. Instead of sitting in a conference room, we're each joining from our homes or offices around the world. Instead of a long presentation about articles that are not published yet, each panelist will have 5 or 6 minutes to convey their main ideas, and each of these articles will be published on the Canopy Forum site and are available for you to explore in the future. This event wouldn't be possible without the work of our amazing editorial team, and I want to thank Rachel Orbetta and Catherine Loftus for helping organize this event, as well as Sierra Butler and Urviva Peretti. I also want to thank John Bernau, our Director of Digital Scholarship at the Center, Whitney Barth, the Center's Executive Director, and Christy Green, our Associate Editor at Canopy Forum, for their tireless work in bringing together all of this, as well as their work in developing the essays that are set to be published in accompaniment to today's proceedings. Indeed, an introduction to the series, written by Dr. Petrie, is actually set to be published on Canopy Forum's site today, so I do invite you all to check that out after the symposium. With that, I want to turn the floor over to Dr. Dennis Petrie, the International Director of the International Institute for Religious Freedom. But before that, I'll provide a few words of introduction to our stellar conference organizer. Dr. Petrie is a professor of international relations and humanities at the Latin American University of Science and Technology in Costa Rica. In addition to his work at the International Institute for Religious Freedom, he is the executive director of the Foundation Platform for Social Transformation, as well as the founder and scholar at large of the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America. He has published extensively on topics in the fields of religious freedom, religion and politics, social dialogue, parliamentary reform, and democracy assistance. And I am proud to say that Canopy Forum has been privileged to publish many of his shorter pieces, which I further invite you all to explore. The idea for this conference emerged a few months ago in a conversation between Dr. Petrie and our team. This symposium explores a rather complicated topic, the complex and multifaceted aspects of religious discrimination, attempting to move beyond traditional analyses and narrow definitions to incorporate perspectives from political economy and human security on this important topic. And furthermore, we seek to explore how and why, despite traditional protections against religious discriminations, minority communities across the nations still face significant subversive discrimination in critical areas of life. The essays authored by our presenters that will be produced on Canopy Forum over the course of the coming weeks are, in many ways, efforts to broaden the field of inquiry when it comes to religious freedom studies, to include economic, social, and political dimensions, and thereby provide a more comprehensive framework for analyzing and addressing very real challenges. So important is that task that we also look forward to seeing many of these ideas developed as part of a special issue of the International Journal for Religious Freedom set to be published in spring 2026. Definitely be on the lookout for that. And with that, we're so excited to welcome you all here to think about these questions together. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dennis Petrie.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Lieberman, for that generous introduction. I am truly honored to moderate this symposium and the essay series on masking religious freedom violation. So before I delve into the topic and introduce today's presenters, I want to extend my sincere thanks to the team at Canopy Forum and the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, because their belief in this project and dedication of time and energy have been invaluable. As Dr. Lieberman mentioned, I've had the privilege of publishing with Canopy Forum several times, and I genuinely regard it as an outstanding platform that truly lives up to its mission. It's an ideal space for fostering discussions on the relation between law and religion in our digital age. Special thanks go to John Bernal, Whitney Barf, Christy Green, and of course, Ari Lieberman and Rachel Orbetta for the exceptional efforts in organizing this event. So the theme of uncovering hidden religious freedom violations has been a central focus of my research. Today feels like a culmination of many intersecting lines of inquiry, and I'm excited to have this opportunity to explore how we understand and often misunderstand religious freedom. So when I became the international director of the International Institute for Religious Freedom in 2021, I asked myself, how can we make a unique contribution in a landscape increasingly filled with think tanks focused on religious freedom? Back when the IRF was founded by Dr. Thomas Schirmacher and Dr. Christoph Sauer in 2007, the field was much less crowded. But as the topic has gained prominence, it's much harder to add value. And one area where we try to do this is precisely by identifying, bringing visibility to religious freedom violations that often go unnoticed. And I must say, I haven't tackled this challenge alone. My colleagues at the IRF, Dr. Janet Ebb Buckingham, Dr. Kyle Wisdom, Marcella Bogdan, and John Bainbridge have been crucial partners. At the IRF, we have developed a violent incidents database, which systematizes public reports of violent religious freedom violations. And unlike other data sets, we track the religious affiliations of both victims and perpetrators, differentiate between state and various categories of non-state actors, count various categories of violence, and highlight subnational differences. And we're about to release our first global report covering data collected over the past 3 years. So please be on the lookout for that. Now, a similar drive led me to establish the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America in 2018. And this was partly a response to the prevailing notion, the assumption, that religious freedom is not a significant issue in the region. Under the current leadership of Teresa Flores, who is presenting today, we have developed a robust framework to challenge this assumption and reveal many underreported violations. And one area that Teresa discusses in her essay is the impact of organized crime on religion, highlighting that while organized crime may not target religion explicitly, it often restricts the activities of religious leaders who stand in its way. And it's an area that's very often ignored. Now, there's still much to uncover. Over the years, I've had inspiring discussions with Dr. Jim Wallace, who's another presenter here. And he has been particularly critical of how religious freedom is framed within US foreign policy, advocating for a broader and more nuanced understanding aligned with General Comment 22 of the UN Human Rights Committee. So what do we mean by masking religious freedom violations? Well, on one level, the goal of research is to discover and describe what we don't yet know. And this will be true for religious freedom research as well. But the idea of masking goes deeper. It's about understanding religious freedom violations that remain unseen because we lack the appropriate perspective. Religious freedom is a multidimensional concept, and while we've made progress in identifying its many aspects, there are still many dimensions that remain hidden. I'm going to discuss 4 different areas where this is visible. The first is data gaps. Many religious freedom datasets fail to capture specific violations because they don't consider certain dimensions. And whilst these datasets have become more sophisticated over the years, they still have blind spots. And this is, of course, inevitable when doing any kind of data collection, but it's important to make those blind spots explicit. And Dr. Danielle Boas's contribution to this symposium highlights one such gap. Discrimination against African diasporic religions is often overlooked for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that these traditions are not always recognized as religions. Second, concealment by actors. Both state and non-state actors are increasingly adept at hiding religious freedom violations, making them harder to detect. And Dr. James Bultema's essay on the Turkish Protestant movement underscores this issue. Missionaries and converts face significant opposition in Turkey, but the forms of persecution they endure are often subtle and difficult to identify. Third, overlooked aspect. Sometimes the research exists, but isn't classified as a religious freedom violation. For example, my friend John Osorio's essay on urban planning shows how policy decisions inadvertently impact places of worship, demonstrating the need for a multidisciplinary approach to religious freedom. And fourth, blind spots. In other cases, entire areas are ignored. Dr. Paula Arana's work on the religious rights of the deceased, particularly Muslim burial practices, illustrates a dimension of religious freedom that is often neglected because it's assumed that religious rights only matter for the living. And so it's these challenges that inspired us, the Canopy Forum and the IRF, to initiate the Masking Religious Freedom Violations essay series and symposium. Our aim is to shed light on overlooked forms of religious discrimination, identify gaps in data collection, and propose improved policy responses. We also hope to explore new frameworks for understanding the complexities of religious freedom. The essays in this series are insightful, offering diagnosis of these hidden issues while also suggesting solutions. For example, Dr. Camila Sanchez, whose doctoral thesis I had the honor of co-supervising, discusses Colombia's efforts in interreligious education as a possible solution to start lifting the mask. We're already planning a follow-up project. As Dr. Lieberman mentioned, we aim to produce a special issue of the International Journal for Religious Freedom on this very topic, inviting all contributors to this symposium to expand on their essays while welcoming additional voices as well. So now let's move on to our presentations. Each presenter will have 8 minutes to share their insights, followed by a Q&A session. I invite all in attendance to use the chat to share their questions. If time allows, presenters will also have the opportunity to ask each other questions. A note to the panelists, if you're uncomfortable with this space, we can edit out sections of the recordings if needed. Well, I very much look forward to learning from our presenters and together developing an improved understanding of the complexities of religious freedom. And now I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Teresa Flores, a Peruvian lawyer and a trusted colleague. Teresa currently leads the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to John, Ariel, to the Canopy Forum team, and the International Institute for Religious Freedom for taking the initiative and providing us the opportunity to discuss these different scenarios that impact the exercise of religious freedom. So the topic that I present in my essay is how organized crime can regulate different aspects of the right to religious freedom. And I have taken Mexico as a case study to develop these ideas. So unfortunately, Mexico continues to be a country in which criminal groups control important territories and even communities. So according to some organizations, some solid organizations like the Global Organized Crime Index 2023, Mexico ranks third out of 193 countries in terms of the scope of criminal operations. Groups like the Sinaloa Cartel, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or the Gulf Cartel lead drug, arms, human trafficking, money laundering, and other illegal activities. And while doing so, the right of religious freedom, as understood according to Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as Article 12 and 13 of the American Convention of Human Rights, is being severely limited. As religious leaders are seen as important allies in the construction of communities, the construction of societies, they come to have a strong popular legitimacy, and they influence the attitudes, the behavior of members of these communities. And sometimes religious leaders become the only link between citizens and the government. And in contexts of crisis or conflict, religious leaders act as mediators in favor of peace, in favor of justice, and for this reason, in areas with little or no presence of the state, in areas that are controlled by organized crime groups, the leadership of religious leaders and the role that they play is perceived as a direct competition to criminal authorities and criminal interests. So pastoral activities with a social or political connotation that goes against this criminal logic in areas where violence, where insecurity prevail, put the integrity of religious leaders, parishioners, and even their families at risk. And in this context, they become victims of harassment, death threats, kidnappings, extortion, and even murder. And sometimes attacks can also be directed at their places of worship. So between January to September 2024, the Observatory of Religious Freedom Latin America, through the Violent Incident Database, registered 21 killings among religious leaders, including Catholics and evangelicals, lay people, and catechists, around 100 abductions, and around 186 religious leaders and members of congregations that have been threatened or physical assaulted, not to mention 107 places of worship or religious buildings that have been destroyed, vandalized, or closed. So if we consider this broad content of the right to religious freedom, if we acknowledge its multidimensional aspect, we will see that these criminal activities, in addition to affect the human security of those affected, will affect also, and not only the right to worship, but also various intersecting rights like freedom of conscience, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and freedom of expression. We can mention some examples. For instance, the right to religious observance, or the right to assemble in connection with a religion or belief, or to celebrate religious holidays, are limited when criminal groups restrict church services, when they conduct ongoing monitoring of church leaders and members, or even threaten to close churches for not paying extortion fees. Sometimes missionary or social work activities are also hindered by intimidation and threats from criminal groups. And even the impediment of access to disputed territories make this missionary work even hard to put it up. Even religious proselytism, understood as the possibility of communicating with individuals, with communities on issues related to faith, can be restricted if the content of the sermons, if the content of the publications by religious leaders is uncomfortable or results in criticism or denunciation of the activities of criminal groups. And in this context, one of the conclusions of my essay is that to comprehensively understand the effects of organized crime and criminal activities in a specific territory, it is necessary to consider how they affect different groups in vulnerable situations. Not just these common groups that, of course, suffer the consequences of violence, like the poor populations, children, youth, women, ethnic minorities, etc., but religious leaders need to be also considered as victims. There is a poor recognition of the obstacles they face in exercising their right to religious freedom fully, and I think that it is absolutely necessary to pay attention to this if we want to achieve a better understanding and protection of the right to religious freedom, not just in Mexico, but also in other Latin American countries where violence and insecurity caused by organized crime are a real issue and have a real impact on the exercise on this right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for sharing these insights. Let's turn now to Dr. Jim Wallace. Jim Wallace is an adjunct senior lecturer in international relations at the PhD School of Global Studies of Boston University. And I'd also like to say I consider him as one of my mentors. So, Jim, we're fortunate to have you in this symposium.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. And thank you to the rest of you for taking the time to join us today. This is a great discussion. Teresa, I really appreciated the perspective that you brought there, because it's things that we, because of our own disciplines, don't always think about when it comes to other people's disciplines. In my essay, I address what I see as one of the barriers to rigorous discussion about religious freedom, particularly when you're talking with leaders from other countries. And that is two words: religious freedom. How do we define those words? Because how we define those words will determine how the discussion goes, in what direction that it takes. Some might see that this is a philosophical discussion that academics like our group have together, and that we sit around and talk about these ideas, but it doesn't have real world implications. Teresa was talking about the real world implications to people in her area. But this has real world implications too. Just one example: the Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights, which happens regularly by the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Every country in the world that's a member of the UN is reviewed on their use of human rights. And one of the things that they review is the issue of religious freedom. But then how religious freedom is defined determines to a large degree how the Human Rights Council rules. And how the Human Rights Council rules then affects how governments view those other countries, and either sometimes bring sanctions against them, sometimes there's financial penalties and other actions that happen. So the issue of how you define religious freedom is of utmost importance in the whole discussion of human rights. The problem really began in 1948 with the adoption of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And it says everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But religion is never defined. It's never defined. And this wasn't an accidental oversight. This was intentional action by the group that put that together. Since then, other international conventions have come about. The 1953 European Convention on Human Rights, the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the 1990 Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam. All of those talk about freedom of religion, but they don't define it. And they don't define what it means and what the scope of it is. In 1993, an effort was made to address this. In addressing the meaning of the precise meaning of religion in Article 18 of the ICCPR. And they said that religion is broadly construed, but they wrote a several page statement on what constitutes religion. And I'll read a piece of it. It says Article 18 protects theistic, non-theistic, and atheistic beliefs, as well as the rights not to profess any religion or belief. The terms belief and religion are to be broadly construed, and it's not limited to the application of traditional religions or to religions or beliefs with institutional characteristics and practices. It goes on and talks about the different dimensions of that. This is the only statement, this general comment 22 is the only statement of any international body that comes close to trying to define what religion means. The complication, and Teresa actually referenced this in her presentation, one of the challenges is that religion is a bundled right. Some would call it a basket of rights. because religious freedom contains freedom of thought, conscience, or belief, freedom of choice, expression, participation in assembly, education and teaching, the right to possess property, the right to have legal status. All of those rights together become a part of freedom of religion. And what happens in international bodies like the Human Rights Commission in Geneva is that when countries are criticized, when countries are challenged on their religious freedom policies and actions, what they tend to do is pick one of these other rights and argue about it rather than actually dealing with the issue of religion. Because again, how do you define religion? Now, the other problem is how do you define freedom? Because it is conceptualized differently in various constitutions and governmental structures and regulatory laws. Since 1648, in the Peace of Westphalia, after the 30 Years' War of Religion, it established that religion was an internal domestic affair, which gave each nation state the right to define how religion would be handled in that country. And that is the principle, cuius regio eius religio. That statement is what has guided religious discussions in international bodies for many, many years. The problem is that when you talk to a country that is autocratic, maybe dictatorial, oppressive, and you say, do you have freedom of religion? They will say, yeah, we have freedom of religion. But when you dig down, how is it defined? What do they do? And how does that compare with what freedom of religion is defined as in the West? For those of us in the United States, we have our own view, which is separation of church and state. But even with that, the Constitution brings forward a principle of separation of church and state, but the definition of that has been given by the Supreme Court. You have other countries where they have formal religious structures. You have Islamic republics like Pakistan or Mauritania or Iran. You have other countries where they have official religion and where government will give funds to support religions. France has the concept of laïcité. And in laïcité, religion is relegated to the private sector. Yet in France, the government supplies funds to support various religious groups and bodies. And they do that under an aspect of a 1905 law. All of this to say that it becomes a difficult discussion when we talk about what freedom of religion is. In China, they have 5 official religions, but other religions exist. And the question comes, so are only the official religions free, or the non-official ones, which are allowed to exist and operate, are they free? So when we go through all of this, my argument in my essay is that when presenting data on freedom of religion, at least at the beginning, something needs to be said about how the actual investigation defines religion and defines freedom in order that there is a clear concept and understanding of what the religious freedom is that we're trying to get at.
Thank you, Jim, for these very inspiring remarks. We'll have time to discuss this. And by the way, I just would like to remind everyone that's in attendance to please share your questions in the chat for the presenters. And we'll address those after we've listened to all the presenters in the time we've scheduled for the Q&A. All right, let's continue with Reverend James Bultema, PhD candidate in theology and religious studies at the Evangelische Theologische Faculteit in Leuven, Belgium, speaking to us from Antalya, Turkey. So, James, welcome once again. I believe we've met in the past. I can't remember where, but I look forward to hearing you.
I think it was online, Dennis. In any case, I have defended and I have done it successfully. So now a PhD holder as well.
Dr.
But thank
Bultema.
you, Dennis, and thank you all for this opportunity, and greetings to you all. I prepared a praesis of my essay that I submitted entitled "The Mask Askew: How the Turkish Protestant Movement Recognized and Surmounted Religious Discrimination." Since 1961, the Turkish Protestant movement has resulted in roughly 10,000 Turkish Protestants who congregate in no less than 210 local churches throughout the country. Such a measure of success was improbable given the prior Protestant subjugation in Turkey and the assertively secular, adamantly Islamic, and counter-Christian nation that the young republic had become. A plausible explanation for the movement's success is fourfold. First, the 1961 Turkish constitution granted an unprecedented degree of religious freedom. Second, international news of this religious freedom attracted missional attention, leading to a new inflow of Protestant missionaries. Third, lawful missionary activity gave rise to conversions from Islam to Christianity. And finally, nurturing local churches, institutional developments, global support, and ecumenical acceptance contributed to the movement's survival and expansion. Although far from perfect in effect, Turkey's religious freedom has been enough for the emergence of the movement. In my paper, I present for your consideration 4 episodes of recurring religious freedom violations in Turkey, with special attention given to how members of the Turkish Protestant movement recognized and surmounted these types of religious discrimination. Although the violations were, in various ways, masked, victims of the violations found the masks to be askew, disfigured, so to speak, by the nationally protective emotions behind them, or by the constitutionally questionable interpretations of religious freedom itself. The first episode occurred in the 1960s, when a missionary was arrested for what was interpreted to be illegal religious propaganda. However, the defense lawyer effectively argued that, according to the new constitution, such evangelism was legal. Although the missionary was absolved and released, during a subsequent routine procedure at the foreigner's police station, he was rearrested, handcuffed, and handily driven to the Greek border and deported, with a persona non grata exit stamp in his passport. Since that missionary's deportation without due process, hundreds of missionaries have been similarly banished, most recently through the use of entry ban codes. Nevertheless, missionaries have surmounted such religious freedom violations by simply mobilizing more missionaries for the missional work in Turkey, as the first deportee himself had left behind a new team of workers. A second episode occurred in the 1970s, involving crises of identity for both a Turkish convert from Islam and his wife, a British English teacher missionary. Their respective identity crises revealed an inextricable link between Turkish ethnicity and Islam in the national mindset. While religious freedom headway since then has mitigated such a mindset for some Turks, it has aggravated the mindset for others, resulting in ongoing social, economic, and political consequences for especially Turkish Protestants. Nevertheless, in an effort to cultivate common ground and mutual trust with compatriots, the converts have sought to synthesize a new personal national identity, epitomized in this quote from another Turkish convert from the 1970s. "By blood and citizenship, I am Turkish. and love my people and land. But my heart and soul belong to Jesus, whom I love and trust above all. As the third and fourth episodes, I briefly recount two worshiping church closures by well-armed Turkish police. In each case, journalists accompanied the police, snapping pictures and taking notes, leading to detrimental media coverage regarding the traumatized worshipers. Nevertheless, I relate how the church closures ultimately contributed to the outworking of especially the collective dimension of religious freedom. The discrimination that had motivated the closures and that had been masked as tactical police attempts to checkmate the presumably unwarranted Christian worship services was itself unmasked. Thus, these four episodes of recurring religious freedom violations suggest that religious discrimination in Turkey is more often masked than it is barefaced. Deportation without due process, stigmatization of Christian identity, and termination of legitimate worship services are examples of violations that those of the Turkish Protestant movement have endured. When confronted with such masked discrimination, however, astute observers in the movement have essentially noticed that the masks were skewed by confusion, hatred, or fear. Be that as it may, Turkish adherents of the movement have viewed their discriminators also as their kin, members of their national family. Inherently, then, in surmounting the discrimination, whether through missionary mobilization, identity synthesization, or religious freedom application, the Protestants have not only served their own best interests, but also those of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, Dr. Bultema, for your presentation. Let's continue with Dr. Danielle Boas, who is an associate professor of Africana Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where she offers courses on human rights, social justice, and the law. Danielle, you've got a very interesting presentation to give as well.
Hey, greetings, everyone. So happy to be here and so happy for the opportunity to engage with broader conversation about masked violations against religious freedom, masked forms of religious discrimination. And the reason for this is because my topic, as was just alluded to, is something that doesn't often come up in these kinds of forums. And so I think that it's really important just to kind of get the word out there a little bit, which is what a lot of my work tries to do. So my presentation and my essay are about masked violations of the rights of devotees of African diaspora religions. And I feel the need to just mention a few because some of you might not even have any sense of what I'm talking about here. So we're talking about Santeria Lucumi or Palomayombe, which come from Cuba, Vodou, which is more popularly and derogatorily referred to as voodoo in Haiti, Candomblé and Umbanda in Brazil, Obia in the Anglophone Caribbean, among dozens, if not hundreds, of other religions, primarily found in the Americas. And essentially what I'm arguing in my presentation and my essay is that these religions are not often seen as religions, and so it's really hard to protect the religious freedom of these communities. And in some cases, they're outright dismissed as religions on the same category as what we often refer to as kind of the big three, the Abrahamic religions. But in some cases, they're just completely overlooked. People aren't studying them, aren't thinking about them, aren't talking about them in forums like this. And so one of the things that I'm doing, and one of the things that's kind of driving my talk today and my contribution to this discussion is that I've been doing a lot of work lately on public opinion surveys about African diaspora religions. And I'm in the process of doing a couple of new ones, but the ones that I've done so far and the ones that appear in my essay reveal some very strong biases, some very strong forms of discrimination against African diaspora religions in the United States. And so just a couple of things that I mentioned in my essay are, for example, less than 20% of the US population, based on a nationally representative survey that we did of around 1,300 people, suggests that less than 20% of the population sees African diaspora religions like Santeria Lukumi or like Haitian Vodou as religions. And in the case of Santeria, more than half of people believe that devotees are practicing witchcraft and black magic. In the case of Vodou or Voodoo, around 2/3 of people believe that these folks, these devotees of these religions, are practicing witchcraft and black magic. And then only around 20% of people would feel comfortable with their children being educated about these religions. So these are just a couple of examples of some of the questions that I've asked on these recent public opinion surveys to give you a sense of what kind of discrimination we're talking about. Now, another thing that I delve into that I wish I had 20, 30 minutes to talk about a little bit, because I think that it's not well understood, is why these stereotypes develop about these religions. And if I can really oversimplify things, we can say kind of the same general thing about all African diaspora religions, at least in the Americas. And that is that discrimination against them dates back at least 200, maybe 250 years, when these religions were associated with a lot of slave rebellions in the Americas. Religious leaders were often providing various rituals or talismans or ceremonies to help encourage the insurgents or protect them from detection, protect them from bullets or other forms of attack. And so these religions were heavily policed as a threat to the institution of slavery. And then after emancipation in the Americas, they were often heavily policed as a threat to public health and morality. They were prohibited in almost every country or colony at that time of the Americas, and were often heavily policed. Authorities were coming in, arresting religious leaders, arresting participants in ceremonies, seizing their religious artifacts, and often throwing them in jail or putting them into forced labor. And so I talk about very briefly about this history of persecution, of racialized persecution of African diaspora religions. And then I get into two examples of how this has led to recent manifestations of these rumors and of discrimination against these religions. In a more kind of global forum is what we're dealing with here. Maybe this hasn't been quite the viral story that it has been in the United States, but there was this widely circulated rumor that reached a peak during the debates for our presidential candidates a couple of months ago. This viral story about Haitian immigrants in the United States eating cats. And basically what I talk about in my essay is that there are a few instances of people alleging that this was part of the religious practice of Haitians, of Haitian voodoo. And in particular, this really picked up on a lot of right-wing news reports where people are saying, oh, Haitians practice witchcraft, they practice devil worship. And of course, eating cats and sacrificing domestic animals is a very big part of that practice. Now, I hope it goes without saying in this forum, but I will say it anyway. This is not a practice of any African diaspora religion. They don't in any way harm any what we would consider domestic animals in this area, so such as cats or dogs. And then even where the stereotype about this being connected to voodoo was not overtly mentioned, what I argue is that it's a stereotype that's so deeply entrenched in how we see Haitians because of a long racialized history of talking about voodoo negatively and saying that it's so barbaric that it involves human sacrifice and cannibalism, also falsehoods, by the way, that it becomes this kind of natural progression for people to say, well, Haitians practice voodoo and it involves all these barbaric superstitions, and this is why Haitian immigrants should not be in the United States. And then I talk about the real world consequences of such negative stereotypes about these religions. So I speak, for instance, about the devastating earthquake in Haiti in 2010 and the violence that Vodou devotees experienced after the earthquake. They were widely blamed for the earthquake, and people interrupted ceremonies, pelted them with rocks, urinated on their shrines. And one of the biggest things is that they denied them a lot of the foreign aid that was coming in, mostly through missionary groups, to Haiti. And then when there was an enormous cholera outbreak of several months after the earthquake, the Vodou devotees were also blamed for that, and dozens of them, it has been documented that dozens of them were murdered in the streets because people believed that Vodou devotees had also started the cholera outbreak. And so, just in summary, I mean, these are just a few examples of what we're calling mass discrimination against African diaspora religions. And I call it masked because I believe that these religions are seen as invisible, inconsequential, and that discrimination against them is masked because they're not seen as religions, they're not included in studies of religious freedom. And when they are discussed, when they are acknowledged at all, they're not seen as belief systems or religions worthy of protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boas, for enlightening us on this very important reality, another mask that, at least in this setting, we are lifting now. So that is good. Let's continue with John Freddy Osorio Cardona, good personal friend. He is a PhD candidate in development and territorial studies at Universidad de La Salle in Colombia, served as a public official state contractor, worked for 3 years at the Directorate of Religious Affairs of the Colombian government. John, the floor is yours.
Good day, everyone. It is an honor to participate in this important symposium. A special greeting to Dr. Lieberman and Dr. Petri, and also to everyone participating in this symposium. My presentation is titled Lessons Learned from Public Policies in Colombia to Identify Violation of Religious Freedom. Just like the majority of members countries of the United Nations, Colombia has an article in the political constitution that seeks to guarantee the right of religious freedom to Colombian people. However, this article is not enough to achieve this purpose. In some countries, the right to religious freedom and belief is mentioned in their political constitution also, but they don't have actions to develop this protection effectively. Colombia has a public policy designed exclusively to guarantee the right of religious freedom. The public policy began in 2017 with 3 kids thematic and 34 lines of action. Among the main results, we have that each of the 32 departments of Colombia have official or public servants in charge of protecting religious freedom. Another achievement is that 315 interreligious committees were created to find solutions to difficulties in different areas. For example, social, environmental, economic, and different situations. The interreligious committees are groups where people from religious entities and the public sector attend together to solve common problems. For example, how to reduce the suicide rate or coexistence problems, or how to reduce unemployment, among other many situations. But also, these actions are aimed at reducing the stigmatization that exists towards religious people in Colombia through the participation and empowerment of communities. I would like to take the opportunity of this moment to invite you to learn about and investigate the different public policy actions that have been carried out in Colombia. Our message is that we must go from having an article in the political constitution to carrying out public policy with multiple actions to guarantee the right. This public policy has allowed us to identify many violations that occur daily. Many of these violations could not have been identified if public policy didn't exist. For example, just two examples because of the time. We identify that it is not only the Seventh-day Adventist Church that has a sacred day. Many other entities also face violation as they are forced to work on their sacred day. One public policy action was the creation of a no discrimination cell. It is a quality standard for companies. It is given to companies that recognize their employees' beliefs and promote respect, such as not requiring work on sacred days, creating neutral space for employee prayer, and training employees on coexistence and respect for everyone. Another example, another situation, we identify through the interreligious committees that in many territories in Colombia, urban regulation prevent places of worship from being built near people, lack basic service, or are not properly located. As a result, urban development often disregards these buildings. In response, actions have been taken to train religious leaders or religious entities on urban regulation. Other create participation space for the religious sector and train urban planners on the concept of the sacred. Also was create the academic network for the respect and guarantee of religious freedom in Colombia, was also created, made up of universities that work on issues related to religion. Due to time, I finish my presentation, and thank you for your invitation. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, John. We should be thanking you because you did all the work preparing this intervention. Thank you very much. So let's move to Dr. Paula Arana Barbier, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Weber Institute for Sociology in Heidelberg, Germany. Paula, welcome.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk here today. This is a new research trend that I'm developing at the moment, so let's see if I do it well. So basically, one of the commonalities of the people that have spoken before me is that we're focusing, when we talk about religious discrimination, on those people who are alive. Like when we talk about, oh, I'm being discriminated, it is throughout the timeline of our lives. Now, in my presentation or the essay that I've presented, it's called Discrimination After Death, the Afterlives of Muslims in Spain. While this presentation is focused or given examples of the Spanish case, the idea is to expand this to a more comparative European view, as this is not a single issue in one country, but I truly believe it is something that is being encountered by several religions worldwide, not just Muslims. So the main ideas of my essay in general, or the research that I'm conducting, is this idea that we need to start extending the timeline of when we can experience discrimination. And as it was very correctly put in the introduction, we need to ask ourselves, do corpses, do dead people, are they subjects to human rights? And that is something that if you look at the different articles of religious freedom throughout, whether it is the worldwide, the International Convention of Human Rights, the European, the Latin American, etc., they never really pose on whether it stops when we're alive or when we're dead. It doesn't really set a timeline, right? But in many cases, once we die, our religious precepts are dismissed. And this is the thing that I want to present today, basically. When I talk about this idea of the afterlife, then it's not a theological concept, but rather is a socio-political one. We need to start redefining the notion of the afterlife into something that is highly political. It is a social matter, and our socio-political life does not end when we die. But rather, there is a whole timeline of things that can happen to our bodies that not only affects the corpse itself, but affects those who are left behind, that are part of these religious minorities. So anything that can happen to the body after we die is part of what can be a subject of discrimination. Now, as I said, this is something that could be combined with the person's religious rights, as in when they were alive, but also those of the family left behind. When we talk about death, we usually also focus on funerary practices that in a lot of cases are not just cultural, but as highly religious, right? One of the issues that in my essay that I'm talking about is the lack of respect for the funerary practices of Muslims, not only in Spain, but in Europe. Now, if you were not aware, one of the highly controversial things about Muslim burials is the fact that they do not bury with a coffin, but rather the body needs to have contact with the earth once they're buried, as well as the timing of burial, right? It should happen as soon as possible rather than waiting for longer. In some cases, these requests are either denied based on blatant discrimination, or just simply lack of infrastructure, as it was mentioned before as well. As little that we usually realize, at least in Europe, the management of cemeteries highly depends on the state. Therefore, we're talking about political rights of citizens here. These responsibilities are based on our governments, and they need to start considering these citizens that die in their territories whose religious precepts are not being respected or included into the management of these places. And then the second aspect that I try to bring up in the essay is that this is not just compressed within a country or a city, but it's rather what I would call the internationalization of death. When we die as well, particularly in communities of migrants, of religious minorities, the ending of a corpse, in order to have this idea of eternal rest, may still involve a transatlantic airplane ride. The practice of repatriation is highly common for two reasons. First, because these people were not made welcome or do not have this idea of a community or a sense of belonging to the place where they died, or the matter of fact that there's absolutely no place or blatant discrimination for them to be buried according to their precepts. So what they need to do is they need to look for this ancestral land. Now, this only doesn't just affect migrant communities, but also Muslims who converted or just do not have a migrant background. As it is the case of Spain, there is around 2.4 million Muslims, out of which at least 1.5 million do not have an immigrant background. So one of the questions that they're currently asking themselves is, what happens when I die? Where am I going to be buried? Where do I go if my country is not providing for me to be buried in the only land that I know? So this one of the things that pops up with the case of Spain is that there's only 40 cemeteries for 2.4 million Muslims. They do not have the space. And the thing is that they're not distributed among the country equally. Therefore, there's cases where Spanish Muslims have to travel between autonomous communities from one corner of the country to the next in order to find a place to bury their families. This also affects the living because, as we know, it is part of our human practices to visit our deceased and honor them after, or especially in certain holidays or on their birthdays. So you're making it difficult for people to have this connection with their deceased after they die. While as controversial as this may sound, and usually sad as when I present it, it is very important that we start including the afterlife as one possibility or place for discrimination to happen, particularly for religious minorities. It is essential because this is not just something that is commonly ignored and under-considered in the area of religious freedom, but also while corpses cannot themselves experience physical pain, those that are left behind can. And when we're talking about the dead, they're still not objects, but they're still not fully people. And this is a gray area that we need to start to consider that highly affects religious minorities worldwide and extends the process of their mourning and the pain by losing somebody when they die. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Again, very, very interesting. I'm really glad that and grateful to Canopy Forum to allow us to have this space to explore these different areas. So let's finish now, last but not least, with Dr. Camila Sanchez Sandoval. She holds a PhD in social sciences from Tlaxo, Mexico, and is an independent consultant in public policy evaluation. Camila, welcome.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you all for this opportunity and greeting to all. My presentation will also focus on what public policy in Colombia says. As John Osorio mentioned, in my case, I will be talking about the interfaith education within public policy documents. My essay focuses on the comprehensive public policy on religious freedom and worship, which is Colombia's first technical policy document aimed at ensuring the right to religious freedom and worship. This public policy was introduced in 2017 in response to violations and acts of discrimination that showed the need to recognize the country's religious diversity. The document, published in 2017, identifies some issues or public problems that seeks to address through its actions and programs. Some of these problems are weak and insufficient actions to guarantee the exercise of religious freedom and worship in Colombia, lack of recognition of the contribution religious entities make to the common good, and acts of religious discrimination and intolerance. To address these complex or wicked problems, the public policy outlines pillars, action lines, and programs designed for implementation. My essay emphasized the transformative role of education in promoting tolerance and respect for religious diversity. Before 2024, or this year, religious education in Colombia was almost entirely focused on Catholicism, which limited understanding of other religious traditions. However, a significant change came with the Constitutional Court ruling T357 of 2024. This ruling required that religion classes in public schools must be non-dogmatic and respect the principle of secularism. Before the ruling, children in public schools in their religion classes only learned about Catholicism, which became a violation of their religious freedom, especially those children who didn't practice this religion. In my essay, I show or details the educational proposal within the public policy. Some of the most relevant initiatives include, or action lines include, first, training media professionals on the proper language to use when addressing religious issues. Second, providing public officials with training on religious topics to improve understanding of this religious freedom. Third, organizing workshops, forums, and educational materials like courses that explain the constitutional and legal framework of religious freedom in Colombian and international international normatives. Fourth, collaborate with universities to create ongoing education strategies about religion and cultural diversity. At present, some actions have been developed in Colombia to carry out these actions, these action lines. For example, a course on religious freedom and human rights promoted by the Congress has attracted over 2,000 participants. Another example are the workshops for media outlets to encourage respectful representation of different religious beliefs and combat hate speech. And also in Bogotá, universities like Universidad Nacional de Colombia, La Javeriana, and La Sabana have also hosted forums and courses to explore religious freedom from various perspectives. These efforts show Colombia's genuine commitment to fostering tolerance and respect for all religious expressions. My essay concludes that interreligious education not only benefits religious communities, but also strengthens social bonds, promoting a culture of dialogue and mutual respect. It also recognizes the important role of religious organizations in areas like education, health, and social welfare, encouraging closer collaboration between the government and these groups like universities, church, public sector, and similar. And it is all. Thank you so much for your attention. Feel free to ask me any question. Thank you, Denise, again.
Yes, excellent, wonderful. Thank you so much, Camila. Thank you all for sharing such a diverse range of both diagnostics and possible solutions to masking religious freedom violations. And I think it's really great that we have this space to discuss this openly and shed more light on those undetected religious freedom violations. So now we're going to move to the Q&A. Before that, I would like to start with a quick reflection on some of the themes that came up in this conversation, and then we'll go to the questions. There's 4 questions that I have received now from the audience. If there's more questions, please go ahead and ask those through the Q&A function here in Zoom. But before I do my start my reflection, I just would like to mention that this is Dr. Arie Lieberman's last symposium as the managing editor of Canopy Forum. I think he did an amazing job. I would like to publicly recognize him for this because he'll be moving to a new and very exciting academic opportunity next year. So thank you, Arie, for all your hard work and the way you've developed and built Canopy Forum as a platform. Okay, so a couple of points here. Well, first, one thing that I grasp from what the presenters mentioned is that religious freedom is really much broader than is commonly assumed, right? And I think Jim Wallace was very emphatic on that. The definitions of religious freedom are often very ambiguous, so we need to clarify that clearly. But it must be done in a way that the definition is kept as broad as possible, because otherwise everything we discussed today, a lot of what we discussed today, will simply continue to be ignored, right? Now, interestingly though, James Bultema mentioned that this vague definition of religious freedom in the Turkish constitution actually was very positive for the development of the Turkish Protestant movement, because it kind of opened the door for their recognition. Right. Second point that I see here is that there's really a lot of assumptions that are being made about religious freedom, right? Teresa Flores talked about organized crime. The assumption that's made is that's got nothing to do with religion because organized crime doesn't care about religion. And it's definitely not true, because we can see the evidence shows that organized crime has a problem with some expressions of religion, right? And definitely restricts it. So there's that. James Bultema talks about, and I just want to make this rephrase what he said. I hope I'm doing this the right way. But in Turkey, religion is collectively defined, right? As in most Eastern understandings of religion. And so to be a Turk, an ethnic Turk, is to be a Muslim, right? That's kind of the understanding. The difference is that with Protestantism, it's an individual choice. And not a collective inheritance, right? And again, that's an assumption about that religion should be collective when there's also individual dimensions that are important. Of course, Paula Rana talked about the rights of the dead that are overlooked, etc. Again, assumption. Everyone seems to assume that religious rights only matter when people are alive, and no, that's not the case. So thank you, Paula, for opening our eyes to this reality. Right? Very important. And of course, Danielle Boas talked about the same thing. African diasporic religions are not recognized. Again, it's assumed they're not a religion, and therefore, in many spaces, and therefore, whatever discrimination their followers face is perhaps not relevant. And of course, so that would be my second kind of cross-cutting theme that I grasped from the conversations. And then there's the theme of concealment, right? I'll just mention two examples just for the sake of time. James Bultema mentions that in a way, what Turkish society, Turkish authorities can claim is whatever happens to Protestants is not a form of religious discrimination, right? We're just protecting national identity, right? So it's a way to conceal. Same thing with Daniel Boas, right? Whatever is done to African diasporic religion is not a form of religious discrimination. We're just fighting social unrest. And this, by the way, as Danielle made it very clear, is based on assumptions that are totally wrong, right? But it's this idea of securitization that I think is interesting. So authorities restrict religion by referring to other things that have nothing to do with religious with religion, and give the impression that they're not really restricting religion, when in practice that's really what's happening. And all this, of course, has real life consequences, right? And I think Jim Wallace was very clear when he mentioned this, right? Definitions matter, because if you adopt a definition that's too narrow, then policymakers and judges can easily say, well, this has nothing to do with religious freedom, and so they can simply ignore it, right? And it also has other consequences, like Dr. Bose mentioned, right? Humanitarian aid being withheld from Haiti and that kind of thing, right? And then coming to solutions, well, John Osorio mentioned that urban planning was clearly blind to religious sensitivities when dealing with, for example, places of worship. And what's interesting is that interreligious dialogue turned out to be a conflict prevention mechanism for public policy to be informed by the sensitivities that different religious groups may have around places of worship. And Dr. Sanchez talked about education, right? And again, it's basically about raising awareness about religious diversity in a country. And so, yeah, these are all solutions we can explore to recognize different religions. All right, so let's move to the questions now. And let's start with Christy Green's question. She's asking about the indigenous understandings of religious freedom that affect religious freedom in Latin America today. And maybe Teresa, you can take that question, please.
Yes, I see that there are maybe 2 or 3 questions directed to me. I don't know if I must answer all of them or just the first one.
Please go ahead and answer whatever you think is important. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for introducing the topic of indigenous communities. I didn't mention it during my presentation for the time. And I honestly don't know if I understood the question entirely, but I can say that indigenous perspectives on religion and spirituality differ from Western notions of individual religious freedom. So when we study or try to understand religious freedom for indigenous communities, we need to consider or include in this analysis the protection of recognition of sacred sites, self-determination, autonomy, the recognition of indigenous traditions, because all of this is embedded in this indigenous cosmovision and is part of its spirituality. And it is important to acknowledge that when we talk about religious freedom of indigenous communities. Now, if this has influenced or not the understanding that we have currently of religious freedom in Latin America, I think that it is important to emphasize that this communitarian character that national governments, even the regional and universal instruments of human rights, they have recognized this communitarian character. And this is important for religious freedom because also highlights this communitarian aspect of religious communities. So I am not sure if, I don't think that every country in Latin America recognizes this as a right that a religious community can demand from a government, like if there is, for instance, the right to conscientious objection for a Christian hospital or etc. That is not common in Latin America. But if we understand this communitarian aspect that it is recognized to indigenous communities, I think that that can be a starting point to starting the discussion about this. And well, there is another question about secularism in Latin America. This is not completely linked with the topic that I mentioned today with this organized crime, but I just want to mention that this Latin American approach to secularism is the result of the colonial history. We know that Catholicism was very, very much intertwined with a state building. So after the independence in the 19th century, many Latin American countries seek to reduce or sought to reduce the Catholic Church power. So this was different with the French Revolution, radical secularism. I think that maybe the most radical was here in Latin America was Mexico, with this 1917 constitution and the Cristero War. But right now, in general, many Latin American countries practice some kind of cooperation secularism. The states are officially secular, but they maintain collaborative relationships with religious institutions, especially the Catholic Church. But at the same time, there is a strong tendency to censor or eradicate and even sanction religious points of view that go against the mainstream politics or the mainstream ideology. So I think that today in Latin America, there are experiences that gave us indications that secularism is not understood entirely as the non-interference of the church in government or vice versa, which is necessary to protect religious minorities, which is necessary to protect pluralism, but rather secularism is sometimes understood as the eradication of religion from the public sphere. And
thank you. Maybe I think let's go to someone else. Maybe Camila, can you please also refer a little bit to the question about the Iberian versions of laicite, secularism in Latin America?
What question, Dennis?
So the question about what perspectives on secularism exists in Latin America, and is secularism understood as a threat to religious freedom, or possibly as a necessary strategy for protecting religious minorities and religious pluralism?
Okay. I think that all the contexts in Latin America, are different. And in the case of Colombia and Mexico, I can say that in Colombia, the creation of a state was, like Teresa says, determinate of religion and state, and this was determined in 1991 with the participation of religious commitments to the creation of constitutional of the 1991. And I can say that in Colombia, religious minorities like indigenous and minorities like how I say new movement religious like New Era not are recognized for the state, no. In the case of the public policy, also the public policy only recognize the church or religions that are established or registered in the Ministerio del Interior. And in this case, about the question, I think that in Latin America is a specific case that, like I show in my doctoral thesis, the religious freedom are composed or are determined by some of determinants. And but I think that in Latin America, the church also plays a principal place in the politics, for example, like political parties, religious, and I don't know how can I explain more. And in Mexico, I know that the indigenous religions are recognized, and for example, the Satanism are recognized. And I don't know if these are different in the develop of religious freedom in normative, for example.
Yes, thank you for sharing those answers. Let me ask a question to James Bultema, please. There was a little exchange earlier in the chat about the Turkish model for deporting missionaries, which one participant says resembles the religious freedom abuses today in Nicaragua. And I think your reply was quite interesting, James. Could you please elaborate on that?
Well, I I thought it was an interesting comment she made, or he made, I don't know who, regarding Nicaragua, and it made me wonder whether this was a growing phenomenon in other countries as well. They can, that is to say, the powers that be in Turkey have exercised these entry ban codes really since about 2019. If the Andrew Brunson affair means anything to you, it was really after the American government kind of twisted Turkey's arm in a sense to get Andrew Brunson released. And after that is when these codes began to proliferate in Turkey. And now hundreds, I can say, have been affected by these codes. And in a sense, they're above the law, you know. That is to say, well, back in, I think, June of this year, there was a court case where the European Court of Human Rights brought to Turkey, pardon me, a law firm in Europe brought to Turkey a case done by many who had gotten these codes, kind of a, what do you call it, I forget the term, where several defendants brought to the court their case to try and get these codes reversed. And the Constitutional Court ruled against it, but not with really any evidence to speak of. And so the government is exercising these codes, applying these codes, often without clear evidence, and virtually everyone who's gotten these codes have not had any criminal record or any proof at all that they were against public safety or public order or posed a security threat to the nation. So it really seems to be just a kind of clever way almost to get particularly missionaries. I mean, virtually everyone that's received one of these codes in the last 4 or 5 years have been Christians and missionaries especially. It's just been a way, it seems, to get rid of them without drawing too much attention to the process. So, and I wonder if indeed this is a growing phenomenon in other countries as well. I don't know.
Thank you, James. Well, it looks like this is a growing phenomenon, at least from what I glanced from the chat here. People are reacting that it's an issue indeed in Nicaragua, in India, and also in Morocco. So there you go. It does happen with some frequency. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Can I now go to Danielle, please? Danielle Boas. Question also asked by Christy Green. Can we say that the mechanisms of discrimination are different or maybe worse for these masked religious freedom violations from the kinds of restrictions placed on religious practices that are more open or obvious? Does masking change the mechanism? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that, so one of the things that I've tried to argue in my work is that African diaspora religions face the same kinds of discrimination that a lot of other communities face, everything ranging from discrimination regarding being able to wear religious symbols, religious attire in public places, discrimination in educational curricula, violence against religious communities. I try to place a lot of these acts of discrimination, these types of violence, in conversation with what's happening in other parts of the world. And so in that sense, I definitely don't want to argue that they're different. I think that it's important to see them as interrelated in conversation with issues facing religious freedom throughout the world and across different communities. The reason that I would say there are two things that the two caveats with that, though. I would say that they're different because the discrimination, at least facing African diaspora religions, is something that, at least in Brazil, they're framing as a concept known as religious racism, which is coined by devotees and activists of Afro-Brazilian religions, but it's something that's becoming a more popular term to try to describe this particular anti-Black racism that is fueling, that has always fueled discrimination against African diaspora religions. And so it's particular, it's different in the role of anti-Black racism in the discrimination against these religions, but certainly not in the role of racism in violations of religious freedom or discrimination against religious communities. And does masking change the way that we approach these, or change the severity of them? I would just argue that the other difference is that we don't see these issues addressed, that as was mentioned earlier, that governments, police, various authorities just kind of dismiss these cases, just kind of treat them as a product of something else. And so they are not systematically addressed in the way that one might address anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, that kind of thing. They're not recognized as a wave, as a phenomenon in the way that they need to be. And that devotees are often also not believed when they make reports. So those are the things that I would say for this brief forum. Yeah, I appreciate the question.
Thank you, Danielle. That's very enlightening. I want to ask all the panelists, give them the opportunity to at least answer one question. So maybe we won't be able to go over all the questions that are being asked. But let's go to Paula Arana now. There's a question in the chat that says, well, how you bring a very interesting dimension of religious freedom. How would this apply to the unborn, when the constitutional right to abortion clashes with religious teaching that life begins at conception?
I am not equipped to answer that question. I'm so sorry.
There's of course a very controversial question, but that's absolutely fine. Is there anything else then that you would like to maybe expand upon? Just want to give you the opportunity to intervene once more.
Can I throw something out to Paula as she answers? I was very fascinated by your presentation. I was wondering, how does it apply in the context of civil wars in areas where somebody may be in not their home area and they die and getting back, et cetera, et cetera? Did any of your research touch on that?
Yes, actually, you just opened up a whole thing. I think the case I have the most recent is the civil war in Spain and the creation of Muslim cemeteries, as the nationalist band of Franco used Muslim Moroccans to fight for the liberation of Spain from the atheists. So when they died in Spain, when the soldiers died there, the Franco basically started creating cemeteries, or specifically either Muslim cemeteries on their own or sections. So this is one of the most contemporary precedents of having sections of religious minorities in municipal cemeteries that we can trace for. So this is something that they started doing, and there are historical cemeteries, but there's also mistreatment of these minorities as per them being seen of not belonging to the country. So they take the bodies out. That's basically one of the things that they do, is they exhumate the body and then they transfer it somewhere else, or they do not rebury them based on their religious precepts. So that is something that is very common at the moment in Spain when they find burials, particularly of the Moroccan soldiers. But that the reasoning behind that, it's not just because they're Muslim, but also because of the discourse based on them, seeing them as barbarics and savages that came to kill us.
Thank you, Paula. That's very interesting, definitely, and it's confirmed by a number of statements in the chat as well. So thank you. let me go now to John Osorio. Just ask you a very open question. What solutions would you offer to lift the mask on these masked religious freedom violations?
Okay, Dr. Dennis, thank you. In Colombia, a concept has been developed through the union of academic and public efforts called interreligious and multi-thematic social dialogue. It involves integrating a wide range of actors and topics around the right to religious freedom, such as students, youth, young people, groups of women leaders, peace leaders, and engaging the religious sector in various issues like mental health, education, urban planning, risk management, between others. This approach aims to help people and society understand that religious freedom is multidimensional. The solution I propose is empowering the communities, give education, give to public service, also to religious leaders or religious, because lack education about the concept, the great concept or the wide concept, the religious freedom. It'd be the answer, Dennis.
Yes, thank you very much, John. All right, to finish, a question for Jim Wallace. Question that's asked here, I'll read it. I'm curious about definitions of religious freedom. Even if we were clear and able to define it legally, groups can still be affected by the way religious freedom policies are enacted or protected. What do you think governments can do to not only define religious freedom, but make sure that religious violations are recognized and each religious group, especially minorities, are protected?
Okay, this question is why government and political leaders opt for a very broad definition with very little substance to it, because this question has pointed out the problem and the challenge, and that is, how do you define it? How do you deal with all the different minority groups? And even with that, some governments find ways to get around it. Let's take China and the problem with the Uyghurs. So that's been covered in the international news, big story, and many in the West speak of this from a religious freedom perspective. You go to China, as I have on many occasions, and you talk with political leaders there, they say, oh, this is not a religious issue, this is an ethnic issue. And so when religion and ethnicity tend to overlap, you have governments picking the part of that they can argue safely on the international scene. So when they go to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, they say, oh, the Uyghurs, no, this is not religion. We're not limiting that. We're trying to deal with an ethnic group that is trying to gain their independence and carve off a part of our country so that we can be independent. So this is what makes it complex. This is what gives us all interesting topics to write about, because it's not a simple thing. And I think we can try to do our best. I've been impressed at how many of the panelists have been more definitional in their statements on their topics about what the religion is that they're dealing with, that they're covering. And I think we have to continue to do that. And it's a challenge. It's not easy. It's not easy for governments, and it's not easy for Eastern and Western governments We talked about the difference in a communitarian collective idea of religion or an individual personal idea of religion. That figures in there too. So all of these factors make the definitional piece very hard.
Thank you very much, Jim. And I think we've come to the end now of our exchange. There's really many dimensions to religious freedom, multiple dimensions, right? It's been mentioned a couple times today as well. But there's just so many dimensions that we haven't even thought of, right? And that we should start to consider in research and monitoring, especially because all those things have real life consequences, as we've discussed. And so I think just like when the concept of human security was introduced, we suddenly start to realize that security is not just a matter of national security, border security, nuclear security, which is important. No, but there's also human beings living in states. And if there's no conflicts between states, that doesn't mean that the people living inside those states are having food and shelter and are not subject to poverty or other forms of discrimination, right? So I think we should really open our eyes to a much broader array of violations. And we should definitely, in our analysis, cast the net much wider. I think that's the main message here. And I hope we'll be able to continue exploring this. The essays that you've all produced will be published shortly on the website of Canopy Forum, and the recording also of this exchange will remain available. So that way the reflection will continue. This is really an exercise in deconstruction, in analyzing the language and seeing how we can basically ensure more protection for more religious minorities. To cast the net wider, we definitely must avoid assumptions. I think there's some very good solutions that were offered here in the field of interreligious dialogue, in the field of education, in the field of informing governments, but there's much more that we can explore. In any case, I am very grateful for this space. I really enjoyed it, and I really hope that someday we may also have the opportunity to meet in future, and above all, go more in depth to exploring this topic. So thank you very much, and the team at Canopy Forum also thank you once again. So with this, we're going to close this this symposium, and I just would like to hand over the microphone to Dr. Lieberman for final statement. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much for your contributions today, and thank you, for taking the time to be with us for these past 2 hours. As Dr. Petri said, this is an opportunity to sort of introduce a conversation that we've been having for decades and decades, but really begin to sort of finesse and develop it in a way that meets real challenges. And so I'm very, very grateful to all of you for providing such nuanced perspectives, for contributing your pieces both in writing and also here as précis today. And I'm grateful again to Dr. Petri for organizing this conference and bringing us all together. Canopy Forum is privileged to play host, along with the International Institute of Religious Freedom, to such wonderful scholarship. So we are very grateful to you all, and grateful as well to the audience for being here with us today. As my colleague Dr. Pernau posted in the chat, we will look forward to posting a version of this symposium online for us all to see, as well as the essays in the coming days. Thank you all for being here, and we wish you a wonderful day or evening wherever you are in the world.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.